Alright, in today's video, we are going to be taking a little bit of a deep dive into John Frusciante's current amp rig on the Unlimited Love and Return of the Dream Canteen Era tour. Now, this whole thing was kind of sparked by an image that a few of you guys sent me through Instagram, and I believe it was Propeller Spoon who first posted and noticed this, but one of John Frusciante's amps on stage while they were performing actually was off. You could tell by the switches on it, and kind of, I guess you guys were wondering what is going on, why this would be, and we actually have a really good shot of the whole backstage section of the amp rig that'll explain all this. So let's get into today's video and discuss how his amp rig kind of works and some different details on it. Alright, so in this picture you guys are seeing it on screen just like I am on my computer right now. You see that John is performing in Mexico and the Marshall Major is actually in standby mode. It's not on, at least the head that's on the stage. Now, ever since this kind of era began and John started performing with the Chili Peppers, I have heard some rumors of him really experimenting with different amplifiers and even different combinations of amplifiers. The one that I've mentioned a couple times on the channel is there was possibly at least a time he was experimenting with running mainly two Marshall Majors together for the bulk of his live sound for a couple performances, but I don't believe it's anything he's stuck with. But just to give you guys some context with how John's been experimenting ever since he's gotten back in the band, it sounds like at least those aren't the 100% best sources that I've heard these from, so take that with a grain of salt, but it's something that's been rumored at least. Now that is one explanation as to why we are seeing the Marshall Major in standby mode. Maybe John was experimenting with two of the JMP 2203s on stage and actually miking that up in one of the B cabinets. The B cabinet obviously for the Marshall Major on stage. That's a possibility that he could be doing for different performances with that all kind of in mind. However, we actually, luckily enough, have a shot of his amp rig from the side profile from the exact same performance where we see the Marshall Major on stage, at least the main Marshall Major, being in standby mode. Alright, so this shot here you guys are looking at on your screen is the exact same one I'm looking at, and we're going to break it down together and kind of discuss how this whole setup kind of works. Now, one thing you guys might not have noticed before is that John's main amps actually are set on a platform with wheels on it. So it's incredibly easy for Henry and the rest of the kind of techs to load the amps out of their protective casing onto this platform, stack them all up, then wheel the whole thing on stage, and then all they got to do once the show's over is wheel it backstage, load it all up, and away they go. It's a really easy way of going about it instead of having to take all the cabinets, all the heads on stage and go back and forth. This is a way easier way of going about it, and also just helps with the cable management. As you guys can see, it's actually sat just behind the amps on that platform. Now, the rack unit in behind has two backup amplifiers, which we've already touched on this channel, but I'll mention it here as well. There originally was a backup Marshall Silver Jubilee along with the Marshall Major in the rack unit for the backup amplifiers. However, there now is another JMP 2203 in place of that Silver Jubilee for a backup amplifier. Now, as I already mentioned, this shot of the side profile of the whole amp rig is from that Mexico show where John's Marshall Major, the main Marshall Major, was shown to actually be on standby and not running. Now, we know exactly what's going on thanks to the shot being from the same show. So if you look at the main amps, you actually can see that the cables going from the amp heads to the B cabinets are connected right up to the Marshall Silver Jubilee and the 2203 JMP. You can actually trace the cables going from those amplifier heads into the B cabinets. But for the Marshall Major, you actually don't see that. What you do see is that the cable is just hanging and not actually plugged into that B cabinet. Now, one thing I will mention, I'm sure most of you guys know this, but for those who don't, John doesn't use his A cabinets at all. I don't believe they're there for a backup in case one of the speakers blows or something like that. I think it's mainly just for stage presence. Full stacks are always how John has had his rigs set up, and it's not quite the same thing when you just have a half stack on stage versus three full stacks. It just looks cool, and I think that's honestly what they're kind of going for in terms of that rig. But you actually can see that there is a cable going out of the Marshall Major's B cabinet back towards the backup amp rig. And if you look at the two backup amplifiers, the JMP 2203 has nothing going into it. Both inputs have no plugs going into it. But the Marshall Major has the plugs into the jacks. And so what we can deduce from this is that the backup Marshall Major is actually what is running for that performance. It's got an input plugged in, and then that cable is going to be going from that amplifier, however they do the splitting, obviously before the amplifiers happen, then it's going to go into that B cabinet. So that's exactly what was going on for that Mexico show. Now with that all said, you guys, hopefully this gave you just a better understanding of how John's amp rig works, and I thought it was really cool to actually see with these images John's backup amp rigs actually in action and kind of a different look at how that whole thing works. So if you see a performance and one of the amps is off or on standby like this one was, chances are it's probably just the backup amplifier that they're running. But as I mentioned, it's possible John's been experimenting. Maybe one night he's running two JMP 2203s. Who knows? I really wish they do a rig rundown with Premier Guitar or something like that, just to kind of give us the idea of how John's actually running his amplifiers. That's the one thing we really don't fully understand with this tour, is exactly what we are hearing on a nightly basis. Exactly what combination. So I really hope in the future we get that information. Because yeah, it's just something I'd really like to know. I'm just very curious as to what's going on. But again, hopefully you guys, this gave you just a better understanding and a look at John's amp rig as a whole and how that whole backup system works. So until the next one, you guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Take care, and we'll see you on the next one.